There is a detail buried inside the itinerary of Mark Carney's recent trip to France that almost every major outlet either missed entirely or treated as a footnote. On his way to the G7 summit in Evian-les-Bains, the Canadian Prime Minister made a stop. Not in Paris, not in Berlin, not in Brussels. He stopped in Dublin. And the reason that stop matters has almost nothing to do with Ireland, and almost everything to do with what Washington has been doing to Canada's economy for the past 18 months. Here is the detail that reframes everything. Mark Carney was the first Canadian Prime Minister to visit Ireland in over a decade. 10 years. In a period when Canada has been signing strategic agreements with Japan, India, the Gulf states, Turkey, and most of the Pacific, nobody in Ottawa found the time to sit down formally with the government in Dublin. And then suddenly, in June of 2026, with the G7 on the calendar and CUSMA negotiations hanging by a thread, Carney lands in Ireland and signs mutual agreements on artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, biosecurity, renewable energy, and food security. Most coverage treated that as a pleasant diplomatic detour before the main event. That is the wrong frame entirely. Over the next few minutes, I am going to show you why Dublin was not the stopover. Dublin was the destination, and why the architecture Carney is quietly building across the Atlantic may outlast anything that gets signed or unsigned in Washington this year. Here is what you need to understand first, because the geography is the strategy. When Britain left the European Union, it left behind a gap that most people outside trade policy circles did not immediately notice. The EU lost its only major English-speaking economy, and that meant that every non-European country trying to do business with the bloc, every company, every government, every law firm, every technology firm looking for a foothold inside the single market suddenly needed a different gateway. Ireland stepped into that gap. Ireland is now the only large English-speaking hub inside the European Union. Its legal system shares common law roots with Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Its tech infrastructure already hosts the European headquarters of Apple, Google, Meta, and dozens of other firms that chose Dublin precisely because it offered American business culture inside a European regulatory framework. Now hold that picture and add one more piece of timing that almost nobody connected to the Dublin visit. In July of 2026, which is next month, Ireland assumes the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. The country that chairs EU Council meetings sets the agenda. It decides which proposals get prioritized, which negotiations get accelerated, which partnerships get announced. And the country Canada just finished signing AI and defense agreements with is about to become the single most influential voice in the room where EU policy gets made. That is not coincidence. That is sequencing. And it tells you something important about the way Mark Carney thinks about leverage. Not as a threat to be made public, as a position to be quietly occupied before anyone else realizes the position exists. Here is what actually happened on the trade numbers, because the official framing undersells the story considerably. Two governments sat down and noted that bilateral trade between Canada and Ireland has nearly doubled since 2020, reaching $14 billion in 2025, with $6 billion of that in goods. That headline sounds impressive. The operational reality is more interesting. The vehicle driving that growth is the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, known as CETA. CETA has been in provisional force since 2017. It eliminates or reduces tariffs on the vast majority of goods traded between Canada and EU member states, and Ireland, sitting inside the single market with its common law system and English language infrastructure, has become the natural channel through which Canadian companies enter Europe and European companies enter Canada. The investments announced during the Dublin visit made that channel explicit. OpenText, one of Canada's largest technology companies, announced a $160 million investment in a new European artificial intelligence hub in Cork. That is not a head office. That is not a sales team. That is a research and development center, which means jobs, intellectual property, and long-term institutional presence on Irish soil. In the other direction, Smurfit Westrock, the Irish headquartered packaging giant, announced a $110 million commitment to its Canadian operations. Capital moving in both directions at the same time is the signature of a relationship that has moved past diplomacy and into the structural phase. It is the phase where private companies are betting their balance sheets that the relationship holds. Now, hold all of that against what Washington has been asking of Ottawa, because the timing of the Dublin visit cannot be separated from the pressure Canada is under at home. The United States has spent the last year and a half using the CUSMA trade agreement as both a shield and a sword. On one hand, CUSMA is the framework that governs over $1 trillion in annual North American trade. On the other, Washington has been pushing for the agreement's upcoming review to include annual check-ins that would give American negotiators persistent leverage over the terms of Canadian market access. Not a settled framework. A permanent negotiating table where every year Canada has to re-earn what it already has. That is the context in which Carney boarded a flight to Dublin. Not as a statement of defiance. He was careful about that. His language in the lead-up to the G7 was notably softened on direct criticism of the Trump administration. He used the phrase hegemonic powers rather than naming Washington. He kept the temperature low enough not to provoke a reaction that could derail the CUSMA talks. But while his public words were calibrated, his itinerary was not subtle. You do not fly to the incoming EU Council President to sign artificial intelligence and biosecurity agreements because you have nothing better to do on the way to France. You do it because you are building an alternative architecture, and you want that architecture in place before the next round of American pressure arrives. This is what Carney has called the doctrine of variable geometry. The phrase comes from EU integration theory, where it describes a model in which not all member states participate in every policy area at the same time or at the same depth. Carney has adapted it as a framework for Canadian foreign policy. Canada, as a mid-sized power, cannot build one dominant relationship to replace the United States. What it can do is build a dense web of bilateral relationships, each one focused on a specific sector where Canada has something to offer. None of them individually decisive, but collectively capable of absorbing the shock if Washington decides to weaponize the trade relationship again. The Ireland visit sits inside that web, alongside agreements Canada has signed with Japan on energy security, with India on trade and critical minerals, with Turkey on nuclear technology, and with a dozen other partners across the Asia-Pacific and the Gulf. Each agreement is modest on its own, but look at the map they are drawing together, and you see something that did not exist 3 years ago. A Canada that has formally diversified its strategic partnerships to the point where losing American market access would be painful, but no longer existential. And then there is the piece of this story that received almost no coverage at all. Canada was admitted this year as the first non-European country to participate in the European Union's SAFE program. SAFE is the EU's joint defense procurement mechanism, designed to pool buying power across member states for ammunition, weapon systems, and military equipment. Getting Canada inside that program is not a symbolic gesture. It means Canadian defense companies can compete for EU defense contracts. It means Canada and European partners can coordinate on joint procurement without going through American middlemen. And it means that the defense-industrial relationship Carney signed onto with France on artificial intelligence and precision defense technology has a structural home inside the European security architecture. Think about what that means in practice. A few years ago, the EU's SAFE program did not exist. Today, it exists, and Canada is the only country from outside Europe with a seat at the table. That position was not available through Washington. It was not something the United States could grant or withhold. It was built entirely through the European relationship, through years of positioning, through Carney's own credibility as a former central banker who has sat in rooms with EU finance ministers and understands the language of European institutional decision-making. And here is where the two stories in this news cycle intersect in a way the standard G7 coverage completely missed. Washington's approach to its relationship with Canada in this period has been transactional and loud. Annual reviews, tariff threats, social media declarations, the tools of political theater. Canada's approach to building its European relationship has been institutional and quiet. Trade agreements, defense procurement frameworks, currency architecture, technology partnerships, AI research centers in Cork, packaging investments in Ontario. The tools of structural change. One approach makes headlines, the other makes history. And the reason variable geometry works as a strategy is precisely because it does not generate the kind of confrontational narrative that invites retaliation. Nobody in Washington is going to threaten Canada over an AI hub in Cork. Nobody is going to post a midnight threat because a Canadian technology company opened a research center in Ireland. The architecture gets built in the gaps between the headlines, and by the time the headlines catch up, it is already weight-bearing. The standard has changed. For decades, the central question in Canadian foreign policy was how to maximize the benefits of proximity to the United States while managing the risks of dependency. That question assumed the dependency was more or less fixed. What Carney has been doing, quietly and methodically, is treating the dependency as a variable. Not something to be eliminated, but something to be diluted. Each agreement signed in Dublin or Tokyo or Mumbai or Ankara is another percentage point of trade, another sector of partnership, another institutional relationship that does not run through Washington. The math does not resolve cleanly yet. Canada still sends the overwhelming majority of its exports south. The diversification strategy that Carney announced, doubling non-American exports to $600 billion by 2035, is a decade-long project, and it has barely started. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has already noted that most of last year's export growth came from existing exporters selling more, not from new companies entering new markets. The structural transformation is real, but it is not yet deep. But here is the thing about architecture. You do not feel it while it is being built. You feel it when someone tries to knock down a wall and discovers that the wall is load-bearing. The Ireland visit, the CETA dividends, the SAFE program membership, the Cork investment, the biosecurity and AI agreements. None of these will make the front page tomorrow. None of them will trend on social media this week. But in 5 years, if Washington decides to walk away from CUSMA, or to impose a new round of tariffs, or to use Canadian market access as a bargaining chip in a domestic political fight, Canada will have a different set of options than it had in 2024. And those options will have been built one quiet agreement at a time, starting on a flight path from Ottawa to Dublin that most people thought was just a stopover. Watch 2 things in the weeks ahead. First, watch what Ireland announces in July when it assumes the EU Council Presidency. If the new presidency's agenda includes accelerating CETA's full ratification, which still requires formal sign-off from every EU member state, you will know that the Dublin visit produced more than mutual understanding documents. Second, watch whether Canada announces any joint projects with European partners under the SAFE framework. Because the moment Canadian defense companies start appearing on EU procurement contracts, the architecture stops being diplomatic and starts being financial. And financial architecture, as anyone who studies these things knows, is the kind that is hardest to dismantle with a single post. The map Carney is drawing does not have the United States at the center. That is not a hostile act. It is a geometric adjustment. And the country that spent a decade assuming it was the only destination on Canada's map has not yet noticed that the cartography has changed. If this story is telling you something you have not heard elsewhere, share it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear it. Like the video if you want more of this, and I will see you in the next.